The English Channel, April 1942. The waters off the French coast churned black under a moonless sky as 6 wooden boats, each barely 70 feet long, sliced through the darkness at 40 knots. Their commanders, none older than 25, knew the statistics. Motor torpedo boats had a life expectancy of 6 weeks in combat. Tonight, they were heading straight into the teeth of the German Kriegsmarine to attack a naval force that outweighed them by thousands of tons. What the Germans didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that these plywood speedboats mounting a pair of torpedoes and some machine guns would become one of the most feared weapons in the European theatre, responsible for sinking more enemy tonnage than entire squadrons of conventional warships. This is the story of how Britain's coastal forces, dismissed by the Royal Navy's battleship admirals as mere mosquitoes, evolved into a weapon that would terrorise German convoys, hunt E-boats in their own waters, and prove that in modern naval warfare, speed and audacity could triumph over armour and firepower. It's about the young officers who volunteered for the most dangerous job in the Navy, the wooden boats that carried them into battle, and the night actions where death came from the darkness at 50 miles per hour. The motor torpedo boat concept emerged from a simple realisation. A small, fast craft carrying torpedoes could theoretically sink a battleship, while remaining virtually immune to the heavy guns designed to fight other capital ships. The idea wasn't new. Torpedo boats had existed since the 1870s. But by 1939, most navies had abandoned them in favour of larger destroyers, considering the small boats too fragile for modern warfare. The British Admiralty, dominated by battleship admirals who'd learned their trade in World War I, initially showed little interest in MTBs. The boats were seen as coastal defence weapons at best, unsuitable for offensive operations. When war broke out in September 1939, Britain possessed exactly 6 operational motor torpedo boats, all of them experimental designs with questionable seaworthiness. The disaster of Dunkirk changed everything. As the British Expeditionary Force retreated to the beaches in May 1940, every available vessel was pressed into service for the evacuation. Among them were several MTBs that made the dangerous channel crossing multiple times, their speed allowing them to evade German air attacks that devastated slower craft. More significantly, the loss of France gave Germany control of the entire northern coast from Norway to Spain, transforming the English Channel into a contested war zone where German convoys could move freely under shore-based air cover. Rear Admiral John Godfrey, Director of Naval Intelligence, presented a stark assessment to the Admiralty in June 1940. German coastal traffic was maintaining the Wehrmacht supply lines while remaining effectively immune to conventional naval interdiction. Destroyers and cruisers couldn't operate in the confined waters of the Channel under German air superiority. Submarines were too slow to catch coastal vessels and too vulnerable in shallow water. The only viable option was small, fast craft that could strike at night and disappear before dawn. The problem was building them. Britain's shipyards were overwhelmed with orders for destroyers, corvettes, and merchant vessels. Steel was desperately needed for tanks, aircraft, and conventional warships. The solution came from an unlikely source: the British Power Boat Company, a civilian firm in Hythe that had built racing boats and private yachts before the war. Hubert Scott Payne, the company's managing director, proposed building torpedo boats from laminated wood using techniques developed for racing craft. The Admiralty was sceptical. Wooden boats seemed impossibly fragile for combat. Scott Payne's response was to demonstrate one of his designs, running at full speed into a concrete dock. The boat survived with minimal damage, its flexible wooden hull absorbing impact that would have buckled steel plating. The first operational British powerboat MTB, designated MTB 102, entered service in January 1941. At 70 feet long and displacing 37 tons, she was built from multiple layers of mahogany planking over oak frames, creating a hull both light and surprisingly tough. 3 Packard 512 marine engines, each producing 250 horsepower, drove her to speeds exceeding 40 knots. Armament consisted of 2 18-inch torpedoes in launching troughs on the foredeck and twin 303 machine guns. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hitchens, appointed to command the 6th MTB flotilla equipped with these new boats, wasn't impressed with his first sight of them. He later wrote, "They looked like toys, plywood speedboats with torpedoes strapped to the deck. I couldn't imagine these things surviving the Channel in winter, let alone a fight with German warships. Hitchens would soon change his mind. On March 13, 1941, he led MTBs 102 and 107 on their first offensive patrol off the French coast near Cherbourg. German radar, still primitive in 1941, couldn't detect the wooden boat's small silhouettes. German sound detection equipment, optimized for submarines, couldn't pick out MTB engines from the general noise of the sea. The boats approached to within 800 yards of a German convoy before being spotted by a lookout on one of the escorts. What followed demonstrated the MTB's fundamental advantage in night combat. The German escort, a converted minesweeper mounting 80 Pilastrem guns, opened fire with searchlights stabbing across the water. At 800 yards, her guns should have blown the MTBs out of the water, but hitting a target moving at 40 knots in the dark proved impossible. The searchlights, instead of illuminating the British boats, destroyed the German gunners' night vision. Tracer fire arced wildly across the waves, brilliant but ineffective. Hitchens brought his boat to within 400 yards of a 2,000-ton merchant vessel, fired both torpedoes and turned away at full speed. The German escort, still firing uselessly into the darkness, never touched him. 45 seconds later, both torpedoes struck the target amidships. The explosion was massive, ammunition or fuel stores detonating in a fireball that lit up the entire convoy. The merchant ship broke in half and sank in under 3 minutes. The after-action report caught the Admiralty's attention. 2 small boats, costing perhaps £50,000 total, had accomplished what a destroyer raid would have required. More importantly, both boats returned undamaged. The casualty exchange ratio was infinitely favourable. By June 1941, coastal forces, the collective term for MTBs and their sister craft motor gun boats, numbered over 40 vessels organised into flotillas operating from bases along the English coast. The expansion brought new challenges. The boats were available, but experienced commanders were not. The Royal Navy's Peacetime Officer Corps, trained in conventional operations, had no doctrine for handling craft that fought like cavalry rather than ships of the line. The solution was to recruit from outside traditional naval channels. Yachtsmen, powerboat racers, and even speedboat enthusiasts were given commissions and command of MTBs. These unconventional officers brought skills the Navy lacked: intimate knowledge of small boat handling, understanding of high-speed manoeuvring, and a racing mentality that emphasized split-second timing over deliberate planning. Lieutenant Peter Dickens, a pre-war racing sailor given command of MTB 234, exemplified this new breed of coastal forces officer. At 23, he'd never served on a conventional warship. His experience was racing hydroplanes on the Solent, where instinctive boat handling mattered more than naval tradition. He later recalled, "The Navy sent me to a 2-week training course on torpedoes and told me I was now qualified to command in action. It was absurd, really. But the absurdity worked, because MTB combat had nothing to do with normal naval operations. It was more like a high-speed car chase with explosives. The boats themselves were evolving rapidly. The early 70-foot designs proved too small for channel operations in winter. Vosper and Company in Portsmouth developed larger 73-foot variants with improved seakeeping and heavier armament. By 1942, the standard British MTB displaced 47 tons, mounted 2 21-inch torpedoes, multiple 20mm Oerlikon cannon, and carried a crew of 13. The engines remained American. Packard V12 marine engines, essentially automotive engines scaled up and marinized, provided reliability that British marine engines couldn't match. Each engine burned 100-octane aviation fuel at a prodigious rate, giving the boats a combat radius of only about 100 miles. But within that radius, they could outrun anything afloat except their German equivalents. The Germans, meanwhile, had developed their own fast attack craft. The Schnellboot, called E-boat by the British, was larger and more heavily armed than its British counterpart. The S-100 class displaced 100 tons, mounted 2 20mm cannon and a 30cm gun in addition to torpedoes, and with diesel engines had twice the range of British MTBs. German doctrine emphasized the E-boat as a convoy raider, using superior firepower to fight through light escorts. The first major engagement between British MTBs and German E-boats occurred on May 9, 1942, off the Dutch coast near the Scheldt estuary. 6 MTBs of the 21st Flotilla, under Lieutenant Commander Stuart Gould, were patrolling for German coastal traffic, when they encountered 8 S-boats heading for the English coast. What followed was unlike any naval battle in history. Both sides were moving at over 30 knots when contact was made at 2,000 yards. Conventional naval doctrine, based on ships that turned slowly and fought at ranges measured in miles, was useless. The action developed like a dogfight between aircraft, boats twisting and turning at high speed, while gunners fired streams of tracer into the darkness. Lieutenant Michael Willoughby, commanding MTB 241, described the chaos. Tracer everywhere, crisscrossing the water like a web of fire. You couldn't think, couldn't plan, just react. I saw an E-boat crossing ahead, turned inside his turn, and my gunner put a burst into his stern. He slewed sideways, losing speed. Then we were past and engaging another target. The whole thing lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like seconds and hours simultaneously. The British lost one boat, MTB 237, to a direct hit from a 37mm shell that penetrated her engine room and caused a catastrophic fuel fire. The Germans lost 2 E-boats sunk, and a third damaged so badly she had to be beached on the Dutch coast. But more significantly, the German formation broke off and retreated, abandoning their mission. This became a pattern. British MTBs, though individually inferior to E-boats in firepower and size, consistently showed greater aggression, pressing attacks to point-blank range where their superior speed and manoeuvrability offset the German advantages. By autumn 1942, coastal forces had expanded to over 200 vessels organised into flotillas from Yarmouth to Dover. The operations were wearing down crews at an alarming rate. Night patrols in winter weather aboard boats that slammed through waves hard enough to crack ribs became a test of endurance. Sleep deprivation was chronic, fuel fumes caused constant headaches, and the deafening roar of engines at full power for hours damaged hearing permanently. Sub-Lieutenant Tommy Ladner, who joined the 29th MTB flotilla in December 1942, fresh from training, lasted 6 weeks before being invalided out with a perforated eardrum and severe exhaustion. He later recalled, "They told us MTBs were exciting. They didn't mention that after 4 hours at 30 knots in a winter gale, you'd be so beaten up you could barely stand. Or that the engine noise would leave your ears ringing for days. One night we took a wave over the bow that felt like being hit by a truck. 2 men were washed overboard. We never found them." The casualty rates were brutal. Between January and June 1943, coastal forces lost 32 MTBs to enemy action and accidents, with 156 men killed. The life expectancy of an MTB in active service was calculated at 14 weeks. For officers, whose position on the exposed bridge made them prime targets, it was worse. Of the 75 MTB commanders serving in January 1943, 31 were dead or missing by July. Yet volunteers continued to flood in. The mystique of coastal forces, fighting a private war in fast boats against impossible odds, attracted exactly the kind of young officers the service needed. Men who found conventional naval hierarchy stifling, who wanted command and action immediately rather than serving years on battleships, saw MTBs as their chance. The strategic impact of coastal forces operations was growing exponentially. German convoy traffic along the occupied coast was being forced to move in daylight when RAF fighter cover was available, reducing efficiency and tying up aircraft. The E-boat force, initially successful in attacking British coastal convoys, was increasingly pinned down defending German traffic instead of conducting offensive operations. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of German naval forces, reported to Hitler in April 1943 that British MTB operations were causing serious disruption to coastal supply lines. The loss rates were sustainable, but the psychological effect on merchant crews was severe. Sailors were refusing to sail in convoys that had been attacked by MTBs, having witnessed ships torpedoed and sunk without the escorts being able to prevent it. The British Admiralty, reading German signals intelligence through ultra-decrypts, understood they'd found a weapon that was achieving results far beyond its modest cost. A single MTB flotilla, costing less than 1 destroyer, was tying down dozens of German patrol vessels and forcing changes in enemy operational patterns. The evolution of tactics continued. By mid-1943, MTB flotillas were operating in coordination with motor gun boats, which traded torpedoes for heavier gun armament. The MGBs would engage escorts while MTBs slipped past to attack merchant vessels. This combined arms approach proved devastatingly effective, with kill rates doubling even as German defences improved. The technical arms race intensified. The British developed a new 77-foot MTB with improved seakeeping and upgraded engines producing 4,200 horsepower total, pushing speeds to 45 knots. Armament increased to include 6-pounder guns capable of engaging E-boats on equal terms. Radar, initially too primitive for small boat installations, was miniaturized and fitted to flotilla leaders, giving British boats the ability to detect targets in complete darkness. The Germans responded with improved fire control systems, better radar, and heavier armament on E-boats. The S-100 class gave way to the S-130, displacing 110 tons, and mounting a 40mm Bofors gun that could destroy an MTB with a single hit. German doctrine shifted toward fighting gun actions rather than torpedo attacks, playing to their advantages in firepower and protection. The balance of technical advantages began shifting German favour by late 1943. E-boats were sinking more MTBs than they lost in return. The British advantage in crew quality and aggressive tactics was being eroded by German experience and superior equipment. Something had to change. The answer came from an unexpected source: American manufacturing. The United States had been building PT boats, their version of MTBs, using mass production techniques. The British government, desperate for hulls to replace losses, ordered 100 American-built MTBs through Lend-Lease. These Higgins-built boats arrived in Britain starting in January 1944. The American boats were eye-opening. Where British MTBs were crafted by skilled boatwrights using traditional methods, the Higgins boats were mass-produced from standardized parts. Hulls were built from plywood sheets over prefabricated frames. Engines were automotive units requiring no special marine training to maintain. Weapons mounts were interchangeable. The entire boat was designed for ease of production and repair rather than elegant craftsmanship. British crews initially hated them. The ride was harsh. The build quality seemed shoddy compared to Vosper or British powerboat products, and the standardization meant boats lacked the individual character of British-built craft. But the American boats had one overwhelming advantage. They were available in quantity. When an American-built MTB was lost, another arrived within days. Battle damage that would take weeks to repair on a British boat could be fixed overnight on a Higgins by swapping out damaged sections. Lieutenant Commander Robert Allen, who transitioned from commanding British-built MTBs to American boats, summarized the difference. The British boats were better in almost every measurable way. Better sea boats, better finish, better crew accommodations, but the American boats were there. When I lost my British MTB in March, it took 6 weeks to get a replacement. When I lost the American boat in May, I had a new one in 3 days. In this kind of war, availability matters more than quality. By spring 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France, coastal forces had grown to over 350 vessels. The operational tempo intensified dramatically. MTB flotillas were conducting nightly sweeps along the invasion coast, charting German defences and eliminating patrol craft that might detect the invasion fleet. The night of June 5–6, 1944, the eve of D-Day, saw the largest coastal forces operation of the war. 64 MTBs and MGBs formed a protective screen between the invasion fleet and German naval forces in Cherbourg and Le Havre. Their mission was to intercept any German destroyers or E-boats attempting to reach the landing beaches. The German response was immediate but fragmented. E-boats from Le Havre attempted to break through to the landing zones around midnight. They ran headlong into MTB flotillas positioned exactly where British intelligence had predicted they would come. The resulting action, fought in complete darkness with both sides relying on radar and tracer fire for targeting, became known as the Battle of Barfleur. Lieutenant Commander Peter Howes, leading 6 MTBs of the 65th Flotilla, made contact with 8 E-boats at 047 hours. His after-action report captured the intensity. Radar contact at 3,000 yards, closed at full speed to 1,000 yards before visual acquisition. E-boats were in line ahead, making for the fleet anchorage. We attacked from their port beam, catching them by surprise. My boat fired both torpedoes at 800 yards at the leading E-boat. One hit, massive explosion. The target broke in half, both ends sinking within 30 seconds. The rest of the German formation scattered. We pursued, engaging with gunfire. The action lasted 17 minutes. We sank 2 more E-boats, damaged at least 1 other. Lost MTB 467 to return fire, hit in the fuel tanks, burned completely. 14 survivors recovered. Mission accomplished. No German units reached the invasion fleet. Across the Channel that night, similar actions played out repeatedly. The German E-boat force, one of the few naval weapons that might have inflicted serious damage on the crowded invasion beaches, was intercepted and decimated by MTB screens. By dawn, 11 E-boats had been sunk or damaged so badly they were effectively destroyed. Not a single German torpedo boat reached the landing zones. The cost was high. The British lost 9 MTBs with 73 men killed. But the exchange ratio remained favourable, and more critically, the mission succeeded. The invasion fleet was protected during its most vulnerable phase. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, Allied naval commander for the invasion, specifically commended coastal forces in his after-action report. The protection provided by our light coastal craft was instrumental in preventing enemy interference with the landings. Their aggressive tactics kept German naval forces at bay during the critical hours. Following D-Day, coastal forces operations shifted to supporting the advance along the French coast. MTBs worked in conjunction with ground forces, interdicting German coastal traffic attempting to resupply isolated garrisons. The boats operated from forward bases that moved with the advancing armies, sometimes setting up in ports captured only days earlier. These operations demonstrated the MTB's versatility. In addition to torpedo attacks on shipping, the boats conducted shore bombardment, inserted commando teams behind enemy lines, evacuated downed aircrews, and served as high-speed courier vessels. The flexibility came from their speed and small size, allowing operations in waters too shallow or confined for conventional warships. Lieutenant John Perkins, commanding MTB 459, spent September 1944 operating from hastily captured Belgian ports, supporting the advance into Holland. His mission logs reveal the variety of tasks. September 3rd, torpedoed German armed trawler off Zeebrugge. September 5th, shore bombardment of German coastal battery, Blankenberg. September 7th, evacuated 6 RAF aircrew from Dingy, 15 miles off Dutch coast. September 9th, inserted commando reconnaissance team near Flushing. September 12th, engaged 3 E-boats, no result, heavy damage to own boat, 3 casualties. The campaign cost Perkins his boat on September 18th when MTB 459 struck a mine off the Scheldt estuary. He and his crew survived, were back in action with a replacement boat within 72 hours. The incident highlighted both the dangers of inshore operations and the sustainability of MTB forces. Losses that would have been crippling to a destroyer flotilla were merely setbacks for coastal forces. As Allied armies advanced into Germany itself, MTB operations continued against German shipping in the Baltic and North Sea. The final major action came on May 3, 1945, 5 days before Germany's surrender, when MTBs from the 57th Flotilla intercepted a German convoy, evacuating troops from Denmark. Lieutenant Commander Michael Stokes, leading 8 MTBs, found the convoy of 4 merchant ships escorted by 2 destroyers 60 miles off the Danish coast. By any conventional assessment, attacking destroyers with MTBs was suicide. The German warships each mounted 5 5-inch guns, 40 mm and 20 mm anti-aircraft batteries, and torpedoes of their own. They outweighed the entire British force by thousands of tons. Stokes attacked anyway, using darkness and speed to offset the German advantages. Splitting his force, he sent 4 boats as decoys to draw the destroyers away from the convoy, while his division closed on the merchant ships. The plan worked perfectly. The German destroyers, detecting the decoy force on radar, turned to engage, leaving the merchant vessels protected only by their own light armament. Stokes' boats closed to 600 yards before being detected, fired torpedoes at point-blank range, and withdrew at full speed before the destroyers could react. 3 of the 4 merchant ships were hit, all 3 sinking within minutes. Over 800 German soldiers drowned. The destroyers pursued but couldn't catch the MTBs in the darkness. All 8 British boats returned safely. It was the last MTB torpedo attack of the European War. 5 days later, Germany surrendered. In the 6 years of conflict, British coastal forces had sunk or damaged over 400 German vessels, totaling approximately 150,000 tons, laid thousands of mines, and conducted countless special operations. The cost was 344 MTBs, and MGBs lost to all causes with over 1,700 men killed. The statistics tell only part of the story. The real impact of coastal forces lay in their strategic effect far beyond their actual sinkings. German coastal traffic, vital for supplying isolated garrisons along the occupied coasts, was forced into inefficient routing and required massive escort forces. The E-boat fleet, which might have inflicted severe damage on British convoys, was instead tied down defending German shipping. Hundreds of German patrol vessels and thousands of personnel were dedicated to countering a threat that never cost Britain more than a few £1,000,000 annually. The kill ratio in direct engagements favoured the British despite German advantages in individual boat quality. British MTBs and MGBs destroyed 86 E-boats and damaged scores more while losing 57 boats to E-boat action. The difference came down to crew quality and tactical aggression. British coastal forces officers, trained in a culture that emphasised closing to point-blank range and fighting gun actions as knife fights, consistently proved more willing to accept risk than their German counterparts. Post-war analysis by German naval historians confirmed what British commanders had observed. The E-boat force, technically superior in almost every measurable parameter, was defeated by an enemy willing to sacrifice individual advantages for mission accomplishment. German doctrine emphasised preserving the boat and crew, withdrawing when faced with superior forces. British doctrine emphasised completing the mission regardless of cost. In the calculus of attrition warfare, the British approach won. The human cost deserves consideration beyond statistics. The average age of an MTB commander was 23. Many were teenagers when they took command, boys given wooden boats and told to attack ships 10 times their size. The psychological strain was immense. Combat occurred at night, in darkness, where you couldn't see the enemy until tracer fire was already incoming. The boats offered no protection, wooden hulls that cannon shells punched through like cardboard. Survival depended on speed, manoeuvrability, and luck. Lieutenant David Horn, who served 2 years in coastal forces before being invalided out with what would now be diagnosed as severe PTSD, attempted to describe the experience in a letter to his family written in 1946. You can't explain it to someone who wasn't there. The darkness, the noise, the tracer fire streaming across the water, the knowledge that one hit could turn your boat into a floating bonfire with no way to escape. We lost friends, saw boats explode and sink in seconds, pulled burned men from the water knowing they'd die before morning, and the next night we went out again because that was the job. Some handled it better than others. Some never handled it at all but kept going anyway because stopping meant letting your crew down. I don't know which was braver. The technical legacy of MTB warfare influenced naval doctrine well beyond 1945. The concept of small, fast attack craft carrying disproportionate firepower became foundational to many post-war navies. The Israeli Navy built its strategy around fast attack craft armed with missiles, essentially MTBs adapted for guided weapons. The Soviet Navy developed extensive fleets of patrol boats and corvettes based on lessons learned from German E-boat and British MTB operations. The tactical lessons proved equally enduring. The emphasis on night operations, aggressive closing to short range, and accepting risk to accomplish the mission became core principles in small boat warfare. Modern special operations forces conducting riverine or coastal operations employ tactics that would be immediately recognisable to MTB veterans: high-speed approach under cover of darkness, violent action at close range, rapid disengagement. Perhaps most significantly, the MTB campaign demonstrated that in naval warfare, as in other domains, the relationship between cost and effectiveness isn't linear. A weapon system costing a tiny fraction of a capital ship achieved strategic effects far beyond its price tag by exploiting specific operational niches. This lesson, that specialised weapons designed for specific tasks can be more effective than general-purpose platforms, influenced naval procurement for decades. In 1952, 7 years after the war's end, the British Admiralty published an internal assessment of coastal forces operations. The conclusion acknowledged what had been clear to those who served. The MTB force represented one of the most cost-effective investments of the war. For less than the cost of 2 destroyers, we fielded a force that tied down significant German resources, protected our own shipping, supported amphibious operations, and conducted offensive operations in waters where conventional forces could not operate. The innovation lay not in technology, but in doctrine, the willingness to accept high individual loss rates in exchange for operational effectiveness. This willingness, more than any technical advantage, determined the outcome of the coastal war. In 1985, veterans of British coastal forces and German E-boat crews met in Hamburg for a reunion. Former enemies, now old men, shared memories of the night battles fought 4 decades earlier. The conversations revealed a mutual respect that transcended national boundaries. Korvettenkapitän Klaus Feld, who had commanded E-boats from 1943 to 1945, spoke about the British opponents. "We had the better boats, better weapons, better protection. But they had better men, or perhaps men better suited for this type of warfare. They would close to ranges we considered suicidal, press attacks when any rational calculation said they should break off. We were warriors fighting a war. They were pirates having the time of their lives while also being utterly professional. I feared them, respected them, and was grateful when the war ended so I didn't have to face them anymore." Lieutenant Commander Peter Scott, son of the Antarctic explorer and one of Britain's most successful MTB commanders with 8 enemy vessels sunk, offered his perspective. "We were terrified most of the time but couldn't admit it. The boats were fragile, the enemy was skilled, death was always one unlucky hit away, but we were also young and doing something extraordinary, commanding your own ship at 22, fighting actions that would determine outcomes of battles, having responsibility and authority beyond anything we could have achieved in peacetime. It marked us all. Some couldn't cope with civilian life afterward. They'd experienced too much too young, but given the choice to do it again, knowing the cost, most of us would. It was the defining experience of our lives." The last operational British MTB, preserved at the Imperial War Museum in Duxford, sits now in climate-controlled storage. Her wooden hull still sound after 8 decades. The torpedo troughs are empty, the machine guns deactivated, the engines silent. But to those who served in boats like her, the memories remain vivid. The roar of Packard engines at full throttle, the smell of high-octane fuel and cordite, the weight of responsibility for 12 men's lives, the terror and exhilaration of closing on an enemy at 40 knots through darkness. The handful of torpedo boats that took on the German Navy weren't the largest ships, the most heavily armed, or the most technologically advanced. They were wooden speedboats crewed by kids, led by officers barely out of their teens, attacking warships that should have blown them out of the water. They succeeded through aggression, skill, and a willingness to accept casualties that more cautious commanders would have found unacceptable. In doing so, they proved that in war, as in life, victory often goes not to the strongest, but to those willing to risk everything for the mission. The wooden boats and their crews wrote a chapter in naval history that remains unmatched for audacity, effectiveness, and sheer bloody-minded courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The strategic situation in the Mediterranean theatre presented coastal forces with entirely different challenges from the narrow waters of the Channel. The Mediterranean stretched over 2,000 miles from Gibraltar to the Levant, with countless islands, inlets, and coastal routes that conventional naval forces struggled to patrol effectively. German and Italian supply convoys servicing North Africa and the Balkans moved primarily at night along coastal routes, hugging the shoreline where larger British warships couldn't follow without risk of grounding or ambush. Malta, the besieged British fortress island midway between Gibraltar and Alexandria, became the primary base for Mediterranean MTB operations starting in early 1941. The 10th MTB flotilla, arriving in March aboard the depot ship HMS Manxman, consisted of 6 boats shipped from Britain specifically for Mediterranean service. Their mission was to interdict Axis supply routes between Sicily and North Africa, a 90-mile passage that was Germany's lifeline to Rommel's Africa Corps. The Mediterranean environment proved brutally different from home waters. Summer temperatures inside the wooden hulls exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the boats into floating ovens. Engine maintenance became critical as the fine sand that permeated everything wore down moving parts at triple the normal rate. Fresh water was strictly rationed on Malta itself, meaning crews couldn't wash salt spray from their skin or equipment. Tropical diseases, unknown in British waters, incapacitated men at alarming rates. Lieutenant Commander Robert Allen, commanding the 10th Flotilla, lost 4 boats in the first 2 months, not to enemy action, but to mechanical failures and navigational errors. Mediterranean navigation, with its complex currents and frequent poor visibility from Sirocco dust storms, required skills that channel-trained crews lacked. One boat, MTB 61, simply disappeared on patrol in April 1941, presumed lost to either mechanical failure or mine strike, her fate never determined. But the convoys were there, massive merchant ships carrying tanks, ammunition, and fuel across from Italy every night. British intelligence from ultra-decrypts provided precise convoy schedules and routes. The opportunity for decisive interdiction was obvious. The question was whether MTBs designed for cold northern waters could operate effectively in Mediterranean conditions. The answer came on the night of May 16, 1941. Allen led 4 boats against a convoy of 3 merchant ships escorted by 4 Italian destroyers detected heading south from Messina. The Italian Navy, unlike the Germans, relied heavily on searchlights for night combat, a doctrine that proved catastrophic against small, fast targets. As the MTBs closed to attack range, the Italian destroyers illuminated their searchlights, creating brilliant beams that swept across the water. Allen, instead of being blinded, used the light against its source. The searchlight operators, staring into their own powerful beams reflecting off the water, couldn't see the dark shapes of MTBs closing at 35 knots. Their destroyers' guns fired blindly based on searchlight direction, shells exploding harmlessly hundreds of yards from the actual British positions. MTB 67, commanded by Lieutenant David Germain, penetrated to within 400 yards of a 5,000-ton merchant vessel, fired both torpedoes, and was already turning away when they struck. The explosion was so violent it knocked men off their feet aboard Germain's boat. The merchant ship, loaded with ammunition destined for Rommel's artillery, detonated in a secondary blast that lit up the entire horizon. Burning debris rained down across a square mile of ocean. The ship ceased to exist in under 20 seconds. The Italian destroyers, suddenly faced with protecting remaining ships, rather than hunting attackers they couldn't see, formed a defensive screen around the convoy. Allen's remaining boats, using the chaos and smoke from the burning wreckage, slipped past and sank a second merchant ship before withdrawing. Total engagement time was 8 minutes. 2 ships sunk carrying over 200 vehicles and thousands of tons of supplies. All 4 British boats returned safely to Malta. General Erwin Rommel, commanding Axis forces in North Africa, was reading the loss reports within 24 hours through German signals intelligence. His reaction, preserved in his personal war diary, revealed the impact. Another convoy lost to British torpedo boats. The supplies that reached the bottom of the Mediterranean tonight were destined for the 21st Panzer Division. Without them, the planned offensive must be postponed. The British have found our weakness. Small boats we cannot defend against are strangling our supply line. The Italian Navy responded by reinforcing convoy escorts, sometimes assigning 5 or 6 destroyers to protect 3 merchant ships. This massive allocation of resources to defend against half a dozen British MTBs had exactly the strategic effect the Admiralty hoped for. Italian destroyers tied down escorting convoys couldn't conduct offensive operations against British shipping. The entire Italian surface fleet was increasingly relegated to defensive duties. By summer 1941, Malta's MTB flotillas had expanded to 12 boats, operating from Grand Harbour in Valletta. The island itself was under constant air attack, with German and Italian bombers striking multiple times daily. The MTB pens carved into the limestone cliffs surrounding the harbour provided protection from everything except direct hits. Crews lived underground in the same shelters, emerging only for patrols or when air raid alerts lifted. The psychological strain of Malta service exceeded even channel operations. Sub-Lieutenant Anthony Daniels, arriving in July 1941 fresh from training, lasted 3 months before requesting transfer. His personal diary, donated to the Imperial War Museum decades later, captured the grinding pressure. "We patrol every night the weather permits. Every patrol we expect to die. Then we return to Malta where German bombers try to kill us all day. There's no rest, no safety, no moment when death isn't imminent. Men crack. Some freeze during attacks, unable to function. Others become reckless, taking insane risks. The CO relieves them quietly, sends them back to England listed as needed for training duties. Nobody judges. We all understand we're being ground down to nothing." Yet the campaign continued. Between May and December 1941, Malta-based MTBs sank or damaged 31 Axis vessels totaling over 95,000 tons. The cost was 4 boats lost with 38 men killed. More significantly, the convoy losses forced the Germans to divert scarce transport aircraft to supplying North Africa, aircraft desperately needed on the Russian front that had opened in June. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, German commander in the Mediterranean, reported to Berlin in November 1941 that British torpedo boat operations from Malta were having strategic impact beyond their tactical results. Italian merchant crews were refusing to sail in convoys that had been previously attacked. The psychological effect of being torpedoed by an enemy you never saw until the moment of impact was breaking morale faster than actual losses. The winter of 1941-42 saw Malta itself come under siege. German bombing intensified to the point where the island was receiving more bombs per square mile than London during the Blitz. Supply convoys trying to reach Malta from Gibraltar or Alexandria were savaged by Axis air and naval forces. By March 1942, Malta was starving, desperately short of fuel, ammunition, and food. The MTB flotillas, along with the submarine flotilla and RAF squadrons based on Malta, were consuming resources the island couldn't spare. The Admiralty faced a decision: evacuate the surface forces or keep them operational despite the cost. Winston Churchill personally intervened, ordering that Malta's offensive capabilities be maintained regardless of cost. The island's position astride Axis supply routes made it strategically invaluable. The MTBs justified Churchill's decision on the night of April 16, 1942. Ultra-intelligence revealed that a critical convoy carrying aviation fuel in bulk tankers was crossing from Sicily. The fuel was desperately needed by Luftwaffe units supporting Rommel's upcoming offensive at Gazala. 6 MTBs, representing Malta's entire operational strength at that moment, sorted to intercept. Lieutenant Commander Robert Aitken, leading the attack, found the convoy 40 miles north of Malta. 4 tankers escorted by 6 destroyers. The odds were impossible. Aitken attacked anyway, splitting his tiny force to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The Italian escorts, confused by contacts on multiple bearings, divided their attention. In the chaos, 2 MTBs penetrated the screen. MTB 260, commanded by Lieutenant Jerram, fired both torpedoes at 600 yards at the leading tanker. Both struck below the waterline. Aviation fuel, more volatile than standard marine fuel, ignited instantly. The tanker transformed into a floating inferno, flames reaching 200 feet into the air. The explosion was visible from Malta, 40 miles away. Civilians in Valletta, watching from rooftops, cheered as they saw the distant fireball. MTB 265, Lieutenant Hill commanding, torpedoed a second tanker. This one didn't explode, but burned intensely, the crew abandoning ship as fear spread through the vessel. Both tankers and their entire cargo of aviation fuel were total losses. The remaining convoy turned back to Sicily, rather than continuing to North Africa. The Gazala offensive, planned for April 20th, was postponed to May 26th due to fuel shortages. The 6-week delay allowed British forces to strengthen defensive positions and prepare reserves. When Rommel finally attacked, the delay contributed to the battle lasting longer and costing more than German planning had anticipated. A single MTB attack had achieved strategic effects at the operational level. Malta's MTB operations continued through summer 1942, even as the island's situation became desperate. Fuel was so scarce that boats often returned from patrol with tanks nearly empty, gambling that they'd have enough to reach harbour. Food rations were cut to starvation levels. Disease from malnutrition was widespread, yet the patrols continued. In August 1942, during Operation Pedestal, the massive convoy battle to resupply Malta, the island's MTBs provided a crucial defensive role. As Italian and German surface forces attempted to intercept the convoy, Malta-based MTBs sortied to threaten the Axis warships, forcing them to maintain defensive formations rather than pressing attacks on the merchant ships. The tactic worked. Though Pedestal lost 9 of 14 merchant ships, 5 got through, including the tanker Ohio carrying fuel that kept Malta operational. The turning point in North Africa came at El Alamein in October-November 1942. Montgomery's victory was enabled partly by Rommel's chronic supply shortages. Post-war analysis by German historians calculated that approximately 40% of supplies shipped to North Africa never arrived, lost to submarine, air and MTB attack. While submarines accounted for the largest tonnage sunk, MTBs created a psychological effect that exceeded their material impact. The unpredictability of MTB attacks, striking without warning on routes that had been safe the previous night, created constant anxiety. As Allied fortunes improved following the North Africa landings in November 1942, MTB operations expanded. New bases opened in Tunisia, Libya, and eventually Sicily as islands were captured. The boats moved forward with advancing armies, operating from improvised facilities, often under fire from retreating German forces. Lieutenant Commander Peter Evanson, commanding MTBs operating from captured Tunisian ports in early 1943, described the expeditionary nature of the operations. "We'd receive word that a port had been captured, load everything onto landing craft and be operating from the new location within 48 hours. No proper base facilities, no depot ships, just us, some fuel drums, and whatever ammunition we could scrounge. We'd patrol that night using charts captured from Italian forces earlier that day. It was chaos, but it worked. The Germans couldn't establish defensive patterns because we kept changing our operating areas." The Sicily invasion in July 1943 saw MTBs employed in new roles. In addition to traditional convoy interdiction, boats conducted reconnaissance of invasion beaches, inserted special forces teams to sabotage coastal defences, and provided high-speed courier services between invasion forces and headquarters. The versatility that had been discovered incrementally became formal doctrine. During the Salerno landings in September 1943, MTBs provided close fire support for troops pinned down on the beaches. The boat's shallow draft allowed them to approach within 200 yards of shore, closer than destroyers could safely operate. Their 20mm and 40mm guns suppressed German positions that were holding up the advance. One boat, MTB 670, deliberately beached itself to provide point-blank fire support, remaining on station for 6 hours while under constant mortar fire until the tide refloated her. The Italian armistice in September 1943 eliminated the Italian surface threat, but increased German E-boat activity as Kriegsmarine units moved into Italian bases. The Adriatic Sea became a major combat zone, with German forces attempting to supply isolated garrisons in Yugoslavia and Albania, while British forces supported Tito's partisans and interdicted enemy traffic. The Adriatic campaign, from late 1943 through 1944, represented perhaps the most intense sustained MTB operations of the war. Flotillas based in Bari and later Vis operated nightly in narrow waters where German shore batteries, E-boats and aircraft created overlapping kill zones. The casualty rate in Adriatic operations exceeded even Malta at its worst. Lieutenant David Long, serving with the 56th MTB flotilla in the Adriatic from December 1943 to June 1944, survived experiences that tested survival itself. On March 8, 1944, his boat MTB 634 was hit by shore battery fire off the Dalmatian coast. A 105mm shell penetrated the engine room, killing 3 men instantly and igniting fuel tanks. Long and the surviving crew abandoned ship, swimming 4 miles to the Yugoslav coast in near-freezing water. Partisan forces rescued them, and Long was back in Britain within 3 weeks via clandestine evacuation routes. He was commanding a new boat by April. The Adriatic also saw the closest cooperation between MTBs and partisan forces. British boats regularly landed weapons, ammunition, and advisors on Yugoslav-held coastline, often under fire from German positions only hundreds of yards away. The partisans provided intelligence on German convoy movements, allowing MTBs to position for ambushes with precision that would have been impossible otherwise. One action, on May 23, 1944, demonstrated this cooperation perfectly. Partisan observers reported a German convoy moving south along the Dalmatian coast, including a ferry carrying 200 troops needed to reinforce a threatened garrison. Lieutenant Commander Morgan Giles, commanding 6 MTBs from Vis, positioned his boats in a narrow strait the convoy would have to transit. Using partisan signal lights to confirm the convoy's approach, Giles waited until the ferry entered the strait before attacking from both sides simultaneously. The Germans had no warning and no room to manoeuvre. 4 torpedoes struck the ferry amidships. She sank in under 2 minutes in water too deep for survivors to reach shore. German casualties exceeded 150 men. The escort vessels, trapped in the narrow strait with MTBs on both sides, were engaged by gunfire and driven onto rocks. The entire convoy was destroyed in Ni, an action lasting 7 minutes. Giles's after-action report noted, This success was entirely due to partisan intelligence and guidance. Without their observation network and signalling, we would never have achieved the positioning necessary for such an effective attack. The cooperation between MTBs and partisan forces in the Adriatic represents a model for future combined operations. As the war moved into its final year, MTB operations increasingly focused on the Aegean and Adriatic, maintaining pressure on German garrisons that were cut off but refused to surrender. The boats provided the only effective means of preventing German evacuation by sea. Hundreds of actions, most too small to merit individual mention in official histories, systematically prevented German forces from consolidating or escaping. The final major MTB action in the Mediterranean occurred on April 23, 1945, in the northern Adriatic near Trieste. German forces attempting to evacuate from Istria organised a convoy of requisitioned fishing vessels and small craft carrying nearly 800 troops. British MTBs of the 57th Flotilla intercepted them 15 miles offshore. What followed was less a battle than a massacre. The German craft, slow and unarmoured, had no defence against MTB machine gun and cannon fire. Lieutenant Peter Scott, leading the attack, later described it as the most terrible action of his career. They were sitting ducks. We machine-gunned them systematically, sinking one after another. Men jumped into the water. We picked up survivors when we could, but hundreds drowned. It was necessary. They were enemy troops attempting to escape, but it felt like murder. War at its most brutal and least glorious. The German surrender on May 8, 1945, found MTB flotillas still operational across the Mediterranean. Unlike the Channel, where operations ceased immediately, Mediterranean boats continued patrols for weeks afterward, ensuring German garrisons actually surrendered rather than attempting to hold out or escape. The final recorded MTB patrol in the Mediterranean was May 31, 1945, a routine anti-smuggling sweep off Greece. Mediterranean MTB operations, less celebrated than Channel actions, had achieved remarkable strategic results. Over 4 years, approximately 80 boats operating from various bases sank or damaged over 300 Axis vessels, totaling nearly 400,000 tons. The diversion of Axis escort forces to defend convoys prevented offensive operations. The psychological impact of unpredictable night attacks degraded enemy morale and complicated logistics planning. The cost was proportionally higher than Channel operations. Malta and Adriatic-based flotillas lost 48 boats with 324 men killed, a casualty rate approaching 50% for boats and 30% for personnel. The Mediterranean environment, harsh weather combined with intense combat, proved even more demanding than home waters. The Pacific Theatre presented challenges so different from European operations that American PT boats, the US Navy's equivalent to MTBs, had to develop entirely new doctrines. The distances were vast, island bases primitive, and the enemy employed different tactics than German or Italian forces. Yet the fundamental principle remained. Small, fast boats carrying disproportionate firepower could achieve effects far beyond their size. The most famous PT boat action, PT-109's sinking and Lieutenant Kennedy's subsequent survival and rescue, has overshadowed thousands of less publicized but more significant operations. From 1942 through 1945, USPT boats operating from New Guinea to the Philippines to Okinawa sank over 250 Japanese vessels, supported amphibious landings, evacuated stranded personnel, and conducted reconnaissance missions that saved countless lives. British MTBs saw limited service in the Pacific, with small flotillas operating from Ceylon and later Burma in support of operations against Japanese coastal traffic. The 64th MTB flotilla, operating in the Bay of Bengal from late 1944, interdicted Japanese supply routes to Burma, sinking 23 vessels between December 1944 and May 1945. The operations were overshadowed by larger campaigns, but contributed to the isolation and collapse of Japanese forces in Burma. The end of the war in August 1945 found coastal forces at peak strength. Over 1,000 vessels worldwide, including MTBs, MGBs, and support craft. Within months, the force was essentially dissolved. The boats, built for wartime service with expected lifespans of 2 to 3 years, were worn out. Most were scrapped or sold for minimal value. A few became private yachts, their torpedo tubes and gun mounts removed, their military history hidden under pleasure craft modifications. the men scattered back to civilian life, carrying experiences they rarely discussed. The peculiar intensity of small boat warfare, the intimacy of crew relationships on vessels carrying 13 men, the knowledge that survival often depended on split-second decisions, left psychological marks that peacetime couldn't easily accommodate. Many struggled with civilian employment, finding office work impossibly mundane after commanding armed vessels in combat at age 23. Some found ways to continue. Peter Scott became a renowned naturalist and painter, channeling wartime intensity into conservation efforts. Robert Hitchens attempted civilian life, failed to adjust, and returned to the Navy, serving until retirement. Others simply tried to forget, rarely speaking about their service even to families. The strategic lessons of coastal warfare remained relevant through the Cold War and beyond. Both NATO and Warsaw Pact navies maintained fast attack craft fleets, understanding that small, agile vessels could contest waters where larger forces couldn't operate safely. The Israeli Navy's missile boats, achieving remarkable success in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, employed tactics directly descended from MTB doctrine: high-speed approach, violent action at close range, rapid disengagement. Modern special operations forces conducting maritime interdiction or direct action missions employ concepts that would be immediately recognizable to MTB veterans. The emphasis on small unit leadership, aggressive tactics, and accepting risk to accomplish missions traces lineage directly to Coastal Forces doctrine developed in 1941 and 1945. In 2003, at the final reunion of Coastal Forces veterans, fewer than 200 men attended, ages ranging from late 70s to mid-90s. They gathered at HMS Sultan, the naval base that had housed Coastal Forces training during the war. The youngest, Sub-Lieutenant James Morrison, had joined MTBs in April 1945 at age 18, seeing limited action before war's end. The oldest, Commander Robert Allen, was 96, having commanded flotillas in both Channel and Mediterranean theatres. Allen, asked to speak, kept his remarks brief. "We were given wooden boats and told to attack steel ships. We did it because we were young and didn't know any better. We lost many friends. We saw things no one should see, but we also experienced something extraordinary. Complete responsibility, absolute trust in your crew, and the knowledge that what we did mattered. The war produced many heroes in many services. We were just sailors who happened to have the fastest, most dangerous ride available. Given the chance, despite everything, we'd do it again." The last surviving MTB commander, Lieutenant David James, died in 2008 at age 93. With him passed the final living link to a type of warfare that existed for exactly 6 years, from 1939 to 1945, in a form never seen before or since. The combination of wooden boats, torpedo weapons, aggressive young commanders, and tactical situations that demanded their unique capabilities created a brief window where this particular form of naval warfare flourished. The boats themselves are nearly gone. Of over 1,600 MTBs and MGBs built by Britain and America, fewer than 10 survive. Most rotted away in backwaters or were broken up for scrap. The few preserved examples sit in museums, their engines silent, their hulls dried out and brittle, bearing little resemblance to the living, vibrating, roaring machines that raced across dark waters to close with enemies they could barely see. But the achievement remains. A handful of torpedo boats, crewed by teenagers and commanded by men barely into their 20s, took on the German and Italian navies and won. They won not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through courage, aggression, and a willingness to close to ranges where every advantage lay with the enemy except speed and the will to fight. They proved that in warfare, as throughout history, victory often belongs not to the strongest or best equipped, but to those willing to risk everything on a single high-speed run through darkness toward an enemy who can destroy you with a single lucky hit. The thunder of Packard engines at full throttle, the hammering of machine guns, the terrifying rush of closing at 40 knots toward ships that can blow you out of the water, the explosion of torpedoes striking home, these sounds and sensations faded into history with the men who experienced them. What remains is the record of what they accomplished. The wooden boats and their crews rewrote naval warfare for a brief violent period, proving that audacity and skill could overcome material disadvantage, that small forces properly employed could achieve strategic effects, and that sometimes the best answer to overwhelming enemy strength is not to match it directly, but to attack from an unexpected direction at high speed in the middle of the night.